Welcome to the Crime Victims Institute and our CVI Talks, which will focus on understanding sexual assault on college campuses. We're thankful and excited that our panelists joined us today. I'm Crystal Hernandez, and I'm the Graduate Research Assistant for the Crime Victims Institute. I received my bachelor's in victim studies and master's in criminal justice and criminology here at Sam Houston, and I'm currently a fourth-year doctoral student working on my PhD in criminal justice. Here at the CVI, we are committed to advancing research on victimization issues in Texas by conducting research to examine the impact of crime on victims and promote a better understanding of victimization. Today, our panelists will provide insights on campus sexual assault from a research and practitioner perspective. It is our hope that the information presented in today's CVI Talks will be informative and helpful to you in your field of service. So we'll go ahead and get started. Our first question is for Dr. Radajag. So Dr. Radajag, can you explain your background as an assistant professor in the Department of Victim Studies at Sam Houston State University?
Sure. So I came to working in this area as an assistant professor in a very roundabout way. I didn't start out kind of my college educational trajectory wanting to work on issues of victimization and campus sexual assault. I was actually an English major when I was an undergrad student, and I really, really loved stories about women. That was kind of my focus. And I started to realize that there was a commonality in a lot of these novels and literature that I was reading. I was really interested in Victorian literature at the time, and so many of the novels I was reading, the women were experiencing violence, particularly at the hands of family members or partners. And I, realized that there was that thread, that commonality, that theme. And so I started to get more involved on my own college campus in activism about sexual assault that was happening. And I think it was kind of this perfect storm of around the time that I was an undergrad student and then decided to start going to grad school to focus on these issues is also around the time that we started to talk a lot more about Title IX policy. And it was just that perfect storm of wanting to talk about sexual assault and work on these issues, and also us really investigating as a country what should our Title IX policies look like. And so that was where I decided to focus my efforts when I was in grad school getting my PhD. I at first thought I wanted to be an advocate, so I started volunteering and then realized that is not my skill set, and that my skill set was much more in education and research. So I decided to get a master's in women, gender, and sexuality studies, and I got that at the University of Cincinnati, and then I moved on to get my PhD in sociology at the University of Kentucky. And when I was on the job market, I saw this ad for a victim studies department, and I was like, what's that? I've never heard of one of those before. And really just jumped at the opportunity to help create the first ever victim studies department in our nation. And so today I'm an assistant professor at SAM in the victim studies department. I focus on teaching victimology, violence against women, family violence. At the grad level, I also teach a neurobiology of trauma class. That's a pretty fun deep dive on that topic. And my research still really focuses on campus sexual assault, a lot of work on Title IX, and then work just on how we can make our support services better on our college campuses.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Radajak. It's really fascinating and amazing to hear about your kind of journey, trajectory, and how you ended up where you are today. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now I'll turn over to you, Rose. I wanted to ask if you could explain your background as the current CEO of the Texas Association Against Sexual Assault, or TASA.
Mine is also kind of roundabout as Dr. Radajak's, but different. But it is a roundabout way that I got into this work. So I went to Texas A&M University in College Station, and got my bachelor's in business degree. So that's where I started. I started working at the Greater Austin Chamber of Commerce, and then worked at this other organization where I was a project manager. And then from there, started working at TASA. But when I applied for TASA, it was for the business side. It was the business side of the work. So doing contracts and things like that. But I immediately, because this was so outside of my world, like again, in business school, on college. I mean, now that I think about it, and I know we'll get into this later, but when I think about it now, about college and campus sexual assault, it was happening even way back then. And and we'll get into that later. Of course, I didn't have the verbiage for that because, again, it was in business school. We were focused on these other things. But yeah, so I got my business degree, started working at TASA eventually on the business side of things, just fell in love with the advocacy component. And figured out that that is my thing, and being an advocate is what I am pretty decent at. And also having this knowledge, this business background and knowledge kind of helps that balance of like, we've got to have an infrastructure, we got to, have, in order to get money, you have to have a good financial system. So I have that piece of my brain also. I think that helps contribute to the movement, but also have found my knack with advocacy. So I've been at TASA now for over 20 years. I also have my master's degree in leadership and change. So from St. Edward's University here in Austin. So yeah, that's kind of my long, weird trajectory into doing sexual assault advocacy work at TASA.
Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Rose. And thank you both for sharing your information about your backgrounds, and thank you for the work that you do each in your respective field. It's really amazing. So thank you. My next question, just kind of jumping into, campus sexual assault. I was going to ask about the prevalence, but I think maybe we should start with a definition. I think that would be helpful. And so this question is for you again, Rose, if you don't mind. Would you be able to provide like a general definition of campus sexual assault? And it's a two-pronger question, just a general definition, but then also, does sexual assault intersect or coincide with other forms of victimization on college campuses?
So yeah, so a general definition, I'll start with a general definition of sexual assault, and then we'll go from there. So basically, sexual assault is any forced, coerced, unwanted sexual contact. It can include a variety of forms or violence on that spectrum. Never the sexual assault, is it never the victim's fault? And I think all of that, when it happened for a campus definition, if any of those things that happen either on or off campus while you are getting your advancing your degree. I think another definition that is probably not in any books anywhere, but I think that just doing this work so long, I think it's helpful, is when there's this insistence to uncomfortably like objectify someone and then proceed with the unwanted contact and touching. That also, is sexual assault. Then you have your legal definitions of sexual assault. But I think all in all, as we're talking about this group and we're talking about campus sexual assault, that's kind of like the framework that I think should work off of. And as you mentioned, the other part about, does it intersect? So sexual assault as a whole is a crime of, there is intersections in that as a crime. But as far as coinciding with other forms of victimization, it also does that too. There are studies out there that say that someone who does perpetrate sexual violence also is a perpetrator of other crimes and criminal activity as well. So there are other things. So this person who perpetrates this on a sexual assault on someone else, chances are that there's other crimes that they have or have the propensity potentially to commit. So public safety is an issue.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Rose. And so, Dr. Radojek, can you tell us a little bit about the prevalence of sexual assault on college campuses in the U.S.? And are there any notable patterns or trends involving sexual assault among college campuses or college students?
So the most often statistic that we tend to like to cite and that we use is that 1 in 5 women will experience an experience of sexual violence during their time on college campuses. That's the one that we see cited a lot. It has been a statistic that has been confirmed over several different studies, and it hasn't really altered all that much over the past couple of decades. We also, if you get down into the details in different studies, the statistics they're going to find are going to vary based on methodological differences. So if we want to zoom out a little bit more than that, we typically find the range goes from around 14% up to about 23%, depending on the study. And I think that ties a lot back to the different types of definitions that Rose was talking about. Are they using very specific legal definitions? Are they using kind of broader social definitions? How are they asking that question? If a researcher is going to ask a question to say, have you ever been raped? that's going to bring in a lot of preconceived notions about what that word means versus using very behaviorally specific types of questions. So that's why we see such big kind of variation in those numbers. An important thing to note, though, about those statistics is that they are just talking about women. So a lot of our research on campus sexual assault, sometimes it just explicitly focuses on only women, or it's a result of the sample, people kind of pre-choosing, pre-selecting into taking these types of surveys or participating in studies. But we also know, men do experience sexual assault on college campuses, but they are far less likely to self-acknowledge that experience was something that was a crime, that was a type of violence. And even if they do acknowledge to themselves, they're far less likely to disclose based on different types of social stigma that we have, ideas around masculinity and how men should always be wanting sex. Even if we, zoom out from campus sexual assault, just look at sexual assault in general, up until, I believe, 2013, the FBI's own definition of rape did not include men as victims. So we have a lot of issues around that that we really need to continue to unpack. And I'll talk a little bit more about risk. So I'll talk about sexual and gender minorities a little bit later on. But just to know that a lot of the statistics we see are typically only about women. So as far as trends with sexual assault prevalence, one of the biggest ones that I always think about is alcohol. A large amount of the sexual assaults that are happening on our college campuses involve the use of alcohol. So whether or not that's, one party drinking or both parties drinking, there's typically some type of intoxication that is going on when we talk about campus sexual assault. I've, pulled up some additional statistics about alcohol use as it applies. So before we talk about alcohol use of sexual assault on college campuses, a study in, I think, 2017 estimated about 37% of undergraduates will binge drink in a given month. So that's a fair amount of students. So we know that alcohol is a huge part of campus culture on a lot of college campuses. And when it comes to alcohol and sexual assault, one study in 2004 found that about 80% of campus sexual assaults involved alcohol use by both parties. So when we talk about alcohol use and sexual assault on college campuses, sometimes it's that both parties are drinking of their own volition. Sometimes it could be that the perpetrator is plying the survivor with alcohol to get them intoxicated in order to take advantage of them. Or other times folks can go to parties and just target people who are already incredibly intoxicated. And just to tie back to what Rose said earlier, even if a survivor was drinking of their own volition, that still does not make the assault their fault. I always say the worst thing that should happen to somebody when they drink too much is that they have a wicked hangover and you need to take some Advil the next day and rehydrate. The sexual assault is never their fault, even if they were drinking. But alcohol is a huge trend that we see, and it causes folks to not be able to consent. It causes people to misinterpret somebody else's cues over whether or not they want to engage in that sexual encounter. A couple of other trends that we see around prevalence, we have this concept of rape-prone environments that exist on college campuses. And a lot of times those rape-prone environments are hyper-masculine spaces. And I'll come back to that again a little bit later on in the talk, but we're thinking about athletics. So, if we've got, a really big school and football is a really central part to that school. So talking about football and also talking about Greek life with fraternities. So those are two particularly rape-prone environments that we come back to in the research time and time again. There's also this concept of something called the red zone, which is a time of year when we see spikes in sexual assault on college campuses. Typically, the red zone is the first, couple of weeks before the semester starts and after the semester starts. And advocates on college campuses find that they get more reports, they get more people coming in, seeking services that have experienced assault during that time, because there's this kind kind of reacclimating to the college environment. And there's a lot of parties, and especially for first-time freshmen, they're away from home for the first time. Maybe it's their first time drinking, and individuals are targeting those folks. They're taking advantage of those students. And so they see that first kind of couple weeks around the semester that there's a spike. And as I mentioned, for first-time freshmen, we see that when we look at grade level for college students, that sexual assault risk actually decreases as, they become a sophomore, a junior, and a senior. It doesn't mean it can't happen at those later times. It absolutely can, but it is more common to happen the earlier on students are in college. And some of the reasons for that, again, are it's their first time away from home for a lot of them. This kind of sense of independence, and they're trying really hard to fit in this new environment. They want to impress people. They don't want to seem like the odd one out, who doesn't want to party, who doesn't want to hang out, or maybe they haven't had a lot of sexual experiences before. And so they haven't practiced how to give good consent or what to look for. And so they can be surprised in those types of environments. And people are very much taking advantage of that. So those ones. And then the last trend that I would like to talk about with prevalence is the concept of re-victimization. For a lot of students coming to college, this is not the first time that they have experienced sexual violence. And we know that one experience of sexual violence can increase the risk for it happening again. And so we do see that. I see that in my own research when I would interview folks who experience sexual violence on college campuses. I would ask, is this the only time you've ever experienced this? And for a lot of them, they experienced it either when they were children as a form of sexual child abuse, or they experienced it as teenagers. And so seeing that, that they're having that re-victimization and the risk that comes with that is another trend that we see as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Radijak, for all of that really valuable information. I feel like I'm learning a lot here too on my end. So I feel lucky that I'm getting to hear all of this and kind of soak it in preparation for Sexual Assault Awareness Month next month. And so thank you so much for that, Dr. Radijak. And so my next question is for Rose. I did want to ask you, what are some common signs that a college student may have experienced sexual assault?
I am also learning a lot from Dr. Radijak, so I feel like I'm in school again. Thank you. This is great. I love this information. No, I think, well, first I'd like to say that there's no one way or no standard way that a survivor or someone would behave. But there are, as you mentioned, there are some common signs, but I wanted to say, I don't want anyone, if anyone does listen to this and unfortunately, has that experience, to feel like they're not normal because they didn't behave in the way that the podcast said they would behave. So it's just so different depending on the person. It's as unique as a fingerprint for each person. And there's a lot that goes, the intersections of things and experiences that go behind that. But I know some of the things that we've seen, just anecdotally speaking, for especially on college campuses, are those that just kind of withdraw emotionally. They may not be as present as they normally are. They may begin to, of course, grades slipping, not attending classes as normal and as usual, not participating in their normal activities as they would, isolating themselves, maybe going home more. Not wanting to be on campus as much, depending on where it happened, not wanting to be in the town if it happened, outside of campus while they're still, in college, that could be a trigger as well. So there are just many different types of behaviors. And I think it's just very important, though, that we recognize, and that anyone recognizes, is that there's no one way to behave, but that the impact is tremendous on those who have been sexually assaulted. So in addition to those types of behaviors, we've seen where they may try to come forward and talk a little bit and hint about it. So I know we're going to talk later about help seeking behaviors, but yeah, I think I'll leave my answer at that. There's no one way. However, there are clear signs when they emotionally withdraw, isolate themselves. They're not the same. They do not want to attend the parties they used to attend. They may not want to be social anymore. They may be going home more often. Or they may just not want to be around parties, depending on the situation. But there are so many, but those are just some of the more common ones.
Thank you so much, Rose. I love that you said, each experience is as unique as a fingerprint. I think that's so just impactful. Like it really makes the message clear. And then also what you said about like the different intersections, like intersectionality is so important to highlight as well. So thank you for mentioning that. And so my next question is for Dr. Radijak. So talking now a little bit about reporting. Who commonly reports cases of sexual assault on college campuses? And are there any factors that prevent or discourage reporting?
Sure. So I'll start out by saying that not a lot of people report. I wouldn't use the word common at all when it comes to reporting experiences of sexual violence, particularly on college campuses. The vast majority of survivors don't ever make a report either to a police station or to Title IX. That's not a common experience at all. In my research, I don't only just interview survivors, but I also do a lot of research with providers, so people that provide services to students on college campuses. And I would hear time and time again a frustration from them of how do we get these students through the door? A lot of the folks that work in those positions, they really want to help survivors by providing them services, getting them some sense of justice. But they're like, they're not coming to us. How do we help with this? And I think one of my favorite all-time quotes from an interview with a provider that I did, she was a Title IX director at a university, and I was asking her about their Title IX policy and how she felt about it. And then she was like, I really love our Title IX policy. They had put a lot of work into it to make it very intentional, very trauma-informed. But she continued to say, but we never use it. And at the time I was like, what do you mean you never use it? And she was like, well, nobody wants to go that route. Number one, so few students come to the Title IX office to report in the first place. And those that do typically wouldn't choose to go forward with that fact-finding mission and through that hearing process. And there are a couple of different reasons for that. I think we have this misconception in the media and in society that survivors and victims are going to be vindictive, that they, want the person that harmed them to get kicked out of school, to get in trouble, and that's why they're kind of pursuing these cases. And sure, there are folks that feel that way, which is a totally valid way to feel, right? As Rose said, there's no one way to respond to this type of trauma. Any type of response is a valid response. But in my own interviews, that was not what I was finding with the students that experienced campus sexual assault. I have one of my articles has a title on there where she's like, well, I didn't want him to get kicked off the football team. That's why she didn't report. That's not what she wanted. And that's because a lot of these students, they're not being sexually assaulted by complete strangers. I had a student once that I interviewed that was like, well, he didn't seem like a criminal, right? Like, this was my friend, so I don't want this person to go to jail. Instead, they really want the violence and abuse to stop. And so they're not finding avenues that are really providing them what they want in that way. Instead, they're presented with these really punitive type processes. And you can look at, towards transformative type justice as ways to try to have those alternative forms. But most of our universities don't provide that. It's mostly just this punitive type Title IX process. So for the most part, they're not reporting. But we do know some factors that increase the likelihood of reporting. Some of those include things that have to do with the assault characteristics. So that would be, what type of sexual violence are we talking about? If we're talking about attempted but not completed rapes, if we're talking about non-penetrative type rapes, a lot of those students aren't coming forward. But those that experienced completed penetrative type rape, they recognize that as violence, and so they're more likely to report. Also, perpetrator type makes a difference. So if it's their friend, if it's a partner, they're far less likely to report. Whereas if this is a complete stranger, if it's a non-student, they're again are more likely to recognize that as something that fits that stereotype of what, I'm doing air quotes here, right? What real rape is. There's also have been some studies that say that if students have a positive view of their overall campus climate, that they're more likely to come forward. And I think that that has to do with this concept that we have in the field about institutional betrayal, that if students have a viewpoint that their universities don't take sexual assault seriously, that if they were to come forward, nothing would happen, that they're far less likely to want to report. Whereas if they see that their university, believes survivors, they support survivors, that they would be likely to be believed, they're more likely to come forward. There's mixed evidence on how much education makes a difference. So some studies will say, yes, sexual assault training, we have found that if they had that training, they're more likely to report. Whereas other studies say, maybe, maybe not. So there's some mixed evidence on that, but it doesn't hurt. We know that. So there's a chance that it would help. But the main thing is that stereotypical understanding of what real rape is, that idea of a stranger who jumps out of the bushes at night. If it meets those viewpoints, then folks are more readily able to recognize that they experience violence. Whereas most campus sexual assaults are perpetrated by friends, by partners, acquaintances. There's intoxication present. And so people are questioning whether or not what they experienced was even violence, or if, was this just regular sex and why am I uncomfortable? And so if it fits that stereotype, people are more likely to report. One other really interesting finding that we found in research in the last, I would say about decade, is that sexual minorities are more likely to both seek psychological services and to report. And for a while, we didn't quite understand why that was the case, but there's this really great book called Sexual Citizens. It was done at, I want to say Columbia in New York. So I'd say those are the ones that, cause why someone would report. But we also know that there are lots of barriers, but we're going to get to those barriers a little bit later on.
Well, thank you so much for all of that information, Dr. Radajak. It's truly quite fascinating and interesting. And as you were talking, I was just thinking of a recent incident that kind of caught wind on social media about it was a student at a university who she was standing up for her fellow college students who, women of color, several of them had come forward reporting their abuser, but the university had done nothing. And so this student, she, in support of her, friends, fellow students, she confronted the abuser and she kind of took matters into her own hand because the university was not, doing anything to help. And, on her end, she was not a survivor herself. She wasn't personally affected, but she was just in support and, advocating for her fellow college students. And so just as you were talking, I'm remembering this video that literally earlier this week I saw. And so I just feel like this conversation, everything that we're talking about is so timely and relevant. And so thank you both again for everything that you've been sharing so far. And I did want to just, I think I forgot to mention this, but if at any point either one of you had something to add about, the other's questions or vice versa, don't feel like you have to wait till, it's your turn for the next question. I want us to be able to kind of talk back and forth. But I did just want to move on to my next question for you, Rose, kind of talking about those help-seeking behaviors. What are some common help-seeking behaviors that survivors may engage in? Specifically when talking about, campus sexual assault.
Yeah, for sure. And before I get there, I did want to say, Dr. Radachek, and actually what you were just saying about just, the climate culture and, because oftentimes reporting numbers, that's like the big thing, right? How many reports, like all the different federal regulations on how you're supposed to report the number of sexual assaults that happen on your campus. And if there's any parent listening to this right now, for some reason, if you have a campus with higher reports of sexual assault, that is not that's not always a bad thing. That means that they have a process and a, somewhat of a climate that's welcoming and students feel comfortable to come forward and report. And that feels very, that doesn't feel like it's the way that it should go. So maybe I should say it this way. If you're visiting campuses and it says there have been 0 sexual assaults, I think that's where I would have more questions. So climate, culture has a lot to do, as Dr. Radicek was saying, was not only if they're going to report, if they're comfortable reporting, but also with help-seeking behaviors. So I'll round myself back to my question, but the question that you have for me, which is about help-seeking behaviors. So I think what I want to say about that really does piggyback off of a lot of the things that we just heard, is that I think we need to understand that a lot of the times you're not going to have someone to say, hey, I was sexually assaulted. Like that's just not even what's in their brain at this time, right? Because oftentimes they don't recognize what happened, depending on how this played out, may not even recognize what happened to them as a sexual assault or as a rape. They're still trying to question, like, oh, is that my fault? What did I do? Again, all the things that are not true, but all the things that oftentimes survivors do. So there's a period of even processing what happened to them and not recognizing that it was sexual assault. So help-seeking behaviors may be more of just having a conversation about what happened last night. So it's so important that if there's any kind of education that's out there, is that folks just learn to listen openly, validate, I'm sorry this happened to you, whether you believe it or not, which that's a whole nother conversation, because we should believe all survivors. No one lies about this hardly. It's not, I mean, there's stats, whatever, there's always a stat for everything. But I think that's really, really super important. So you're it's not going to be the, hey, I was sexually assaulted last night at 10:55. It's help-seeking behaviors are going to coincide again with the climate. There's societal pressure. Should I even say anything? Everyone likes him. He's in our friend group. Oh, he's that football player. All the things that you all mentioned earlier. There's also this internalization of maybe, maybe I did something wrong, like victim blaming, the internalization of victim blaming. So again, all of that, again, not true. And it's never the survivor's fault, but those are just common things that we've internalized, these misconceptions in society that we've all heard growing up, that often, they affect us when the time comes. So I think for help-seeking behaviors, I think we just need to recognize that it's not going to be as simple as, hey, I was sexually assaulted last night, or I was raped. And it may be, there are times that it is clear, as Dr. Radicek said, when there's certain, it's clear this was violent, this happened to me. But there's also times when, it's kind of hazy, I had some drinks, and I will admit, when I was at A&M a long time ago, I was at that Dixie Chicken taking those shots and having a good old time. That's what we do when we're in college, and that is okay. I was 21. But I think it's important for us to understand that the help-seeking behaviors it may come across in a conversation where they just kind of want to talk a little bit about what happened last night. So I think that those would be good conversations to have around campuses. This is what this looks like, but also here's where you can get help if you have questions. So even our advertisement of resources might need to shift a little bit to say, were you sexually assaulted? Not to say that, but to say something else, like, do you have a question about, I don't know, I'd have to brainstorm on that, but I think that's where some of us get it wrong. We just kind of put a sexual assault hotline number. Well, sometimes they don't even recognize that what happened was a sexual assault, or don't want to admit it. Maybe they're not ready to admit it to themselves. So again, I think that's where, when there's a disconnect, and I hear that all the time from not just college campuses, but from communities, there's the prevalence rates are high, but no one's coming forward. They're not reporting, that's a whole nother conversation we'll talk about later, but they're also not coming forward for help. Well, it's because oftentimes, they're still trying to process what happened to them, and going to the rape crisis center might not be the thing they want to do immediately. So I think it's incumbent upon the experts, those advocates, myself, TASA, rape crisis centers, to be able to be creative in the way that we do our outreach, so that they know they can come and ask questions, that there isn't a qualifier that you understand that you were sexually assaulted, but come talk to us and we can process this together. So I think that there's a lot of work to be done there, but help-seeking behaviors commonly, oftentimes they may just talk about what happened and be really uncomfortable about it. And we hopefully have a network of friends that are like, that's not okay. Let's go and talk to this person, or let's go to the whatever center on college, or the rape crisis center that's here, because they are open for us to ask questions too. So sorry, that is a lot, and that was not a clear answer, but I just wanted to bring it home that it's not that simple. Nothing about this issue is just simple. So I'm hoping that folks will really understand there is a process for folks to even admit that this happened to them, or some might do it immediately. So help seeking behaviors is going to depend on where they are.
No, this is perfect. Absolutely perfect. Thank you so much. Did you have something to add, Dr. Radijak?
I just wanted to say one thing that we also know from the research around help-seeking behaviors is that the first response to somebody disclosing sexual violence is really important. We've found that the first time that somebody discloses to another person, so just tells somebody, hey, something happened, I was uncomfortable with it, they might not use that explicit language of I was sexually assaulted, or somebody violated me or something like that. But if the first time they say that, someone kind of shuts them down and says, no, I don't think that happened, or directly tells them that they think they're lying, if they're met with victim blaming statements, or even surprisingly, the research shows that if the person they tell responds very angrily, not towards the victim, but towards the person that harmed that person, that also counts as a negative response. But if they're met with a negative response, that their chances of ever help seeking or telling another person all but disappears. So that first response to a disclosure is really, really key. And unfortunately, we know from research that most college students, the person they're going to disclose to are their friends. And most other college students are not really well equipped on how to respond to that. So in addition to making sure that we have that education around learning what sexual violence actually is and having those conversations, we also should try to help equip our students with how to respond to disclosures, so that people are listening, right? Make sure that you're listening. You don't want to ask prying questions, right? But that you're listening, that you're supportive, that you just say, I believe you, and that you don't kind of jump down their throats about how, well, you need to report that right away. So, figuring out how to have that good first response is also really, really key, because we know that bad responses can pretty much shut somebody off from ever seeking those services.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Dr. Radijak, because this is something that I've heard of too, just in my own time in school. And it's that first interaction, like you said, it's a make or break it type of thing. And so I'm really glad that you brought that up, and especially when talking about seeking help and reporting and all of that. So thank you for mentioning that. I did want to move on to my next question for you, Dr. Radijak. And so just still talking about like seeking help, are there any barriers to identifying college students that have been affected by sexual assault?
Yes. So I think it kind of goes along with what I was just talking about with that victim blaming. So victim blaming, it's rampant. Rape culture is very much still alive and well today on our college campuses and in our society as a whole. And college students aren't unaware of that, because even in the interviews that I've done for students that hadn't experienced victim blaming from somebody else, like directly, so nobody had said victim blaming statements to them, they feared that was going to happen. So they didn't tell anybody because they were afraid. They immediately thought, well, nobody's going to believe me, they're going to side with this person. Or they've internalized those messages so that they're already telling themselves that it was their fault, because they were drinking, because maybe they shouldn't have gone to this place or gone in that person's room. And again, those things are never that victim's that student's fault. But they've internalized those messages already. And so figuring out how to combat that victim blaming, and I think that goes back again to the campus culture. Are we making sure that we're sending those messages and they're seeing those things? Because a lot of these students, I would ask them at the end of the interviews, if this happened to a friend, what would you say to them? And they would never victim blame that friend, right? But they're very quick to victim blame themselves. So figuring out how to combat that internalized type of victim blaming. And again, they don't want that punitive system like I talked about. So what alternatives are there and demystifying what the Title IX process is like, because students don't know. They think that if they go to Title IX, that automatically means there's going to be an investigation and it's against their choice of if they want to go forward. And that's going to vary from university to university. Schools can really set their own rules around that type of a process. But at a lot of schools, it is the student's choice. In the majority of cases, if they actually want to move forward through that Title IX process. And they're able to get some support services without having to have that finding of responsibility. That's what we call it in the school system. It's responsibility, not guilty. They use different terminology. But what types of services can we provide? Can we move students to different dorms, right? Can we remove the survivor from a class that they might have with the person that harmed them? Unfortunately, without a finding of responsibility, they're not able to put punitive things on the student that caused the harm. But what kinds of options are available, and making sure that that doesn't always hinge upon that responsibility finding. I think one of the double-edged swords of Title IX is mandatory reporting, and how most schools went the route where every single employee is a mandatory reporter. And so that doesn't create spaces for students to have individuals they can talk to on campus that are entirely confidential outside counseling. And while I love our counselors, right? I love the counselors on my college campus. They're amazing. There's a lot of stigma around counseling services for a lot of students, especially students who are racial minorities. There are a lot of kind of stereotypes about seeking mental health services, and we're trying to break down those barriers, right? But when they're going through trauma and they have this idea that they don't want to go to that place to seek services, well, where else can we send them? And so I think making sure that we have those services both on and off campus is really important. I talked a little bit about institutional betrayal earlier, but some students don't want to seek their services on their campus because they feel like their campus has wronged them, particularly if they have reported and they were met with an inappropriate response from the university or a lack of a response from the university. And so they would much prefer to seek those services off campus. And that can work great, right? Like at Sam Houston, we're in a small town, 5-10 minutes, you are at our rape crisis center. It's not far to get there. But what if you live in an even smaller town where your university is and they don't have those services? Or you go to school in a really, really big city and it's very complicated to figure out how to get where you need to go. And we're all afraid of making phone calls nowadays, right? So we don't want to call those hotlines. So having them off campus is great, but also making sure that you have them housed on campus too, and that there is some type of a confidential type resource. Sometimes universities will have MOUs, some memorandums of an understanding with agencies that come and have office hours on their campus. And so because they're not, university employees, does Title IX apply to them with mandatory reporting, right? So there are creative ways that we can try to make pockets where students feel safe to have those conversations, because a lot of times they don't know how it works, right? They don't know what opportunities that they have. And I think along with that, also making sure that we're being as trauma informed as possible as practitioners, but not just those that work in the Title IX office or are counselors or advocates, but also faculty. Maybe it's because of what I teach, but I get a lot of disclosures every semester. So I'm constantly having to make Title IX reports. So how can I teach my course content in a way that is very trauma informed? Because I sometimes see the light bulb moments go off in students' eyes when I'm teaching content, when they have realized, oh, that's what that means. I've experienced that, right? So figuring out how to make our classrooms and our entire campus be as trauma informed as possible is really important. And then one other thing with barriers that I have found to reporting, help seeking, has to do with student identity. I was oddly lucky in one of my studies. I had a very racially diverse sample, which can be very difficult to do. And I found with the racial minority students who attended the PWIs, which stands for predominantly white institution, that they were very, very reluctant to seek services on that campus. And that's because all of the people in those helping positions were white. and they felt like those professionals wouldn't understand their circumstances. They wouldn't understand their context, and they wanted to talk to someone who looked like them. They wanted someone who had that type of an experience. But being able to provide services that fit the cultural needs and backgrounds so that we are equipped to meet students really where they are, because they're going to bring all of those things with us. And if we can't understand the background of a student, then we're going to struggle to provide them the needs that they have. So figuring out how we can do that, even if we are at predominantly white institutions, how can we make sure we have that training to make sure we're providing appropriate services for our students?
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Radijak. I do remember, again, just like in my own schooling and literature that I've read, learning about, off-campus versus on-campus use of services, specifically for like survivors. And one of the things that I remember reading about was many students, they wanted to use on-campus services, but the hours were limited. It's only like 8 to 5, and they had class during those times, or they had class, but then they had to go to work immediately after. And so it's just things that I was thinking about as you were talking. And it's hard, I feel like, and not just about this topic specifically, but in a lot of areas, like having services is one thing, but then having people actually use them and, take advantage of them is another issue. And so it's hard to get people to use services. And so, yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And so I was gonna ask Rose the next question, but I think maybe it's better to kind of talk about like these characteristics first, and then we can move on to like challenges and more like macro level stuff. And so if it's okay with you, Dr. Radijak, I wanted to ask this next question about like characteristics. Do you think certain characteristics such as age, race, or ethnicity or gender make individuals more vulnerable to sexual assault on college campuses? And is there research on perpetrator characteristics?
We have a ton of research about what creates higher risk or vulnerability for campus sexual assault. And I'll start out with gender because I think that's kind of the most obvious one. And that's because for a really long time, our understanding was that women were the ones who experienced the most sexual assault, if we were talking about gender as a category. But one of the reasons we had that finding is because we were only approaching gender from binary. That for a long time, the only questions we asked about gender are you a man or are you a woman? And so if that's what we're restricting our understanding to, then yes, women do experience more sexual violence than men do. But we're finding that as we change our research questions, that gender and sexual minority students have even higher rates of sexual assault on college campus, with women kind of coming in right after them. This means that it's still an incredibly gendered crime, that we can still talk about the effects of masculinity and how that is kind of driving why these other groups are having higher rates of sexual violence on our campuses. But even with sexuality, we find that bisexual women have some of the highest rates of sexual violence on college campuses when it comes to sexuality. But when you look at who their perpetrators are, it is still typically men. And this isn't to say that women can't perpetrate. Absolutely, they can. We probably have really inaccurate numbers about women perpetrating sexual assault against anybody of any gender, because folks don't think about that in that way. So kind of going back to, again, why we don't talk about men as victims. It's this idea of these stereotypes that we have. So women still experience really high rates, but we do find that gender and sexual minorities have even higher rates of campus sexual assault. I've already talked a little bit about age if we think about it from classification in school, right, with first-time freshmen having really high rates of sexual violence. But we tend to find that if we're talking about like traditional college students, I know some people don't like that kind of verbiage to kind of delineate age, but if we want to talk about non-traditional college students or even graduate students experiencing sexual violence as students, we tend to see it functions quite differently from kind of this traditional viewpoint of campus sexual assault. Those students are more likely to be in very long-term committed relationships, often with children. And so we really see that their sexual violence as college students is really happening within the context of intimate partner violence. So we're seeing that as they oftentimes don't think of it as, oh, this was a sexual assault, but more, I'm experiencing a lot of forms of violence in my relationship, and there is also sexual violence as one of those tactics. So we see that there's a little bit of a differentiation there. We have inconsistent findings about race and its risk. So I think that there are unique factors when it comes to different race and ethnicities with experiencing sexual violence. It's not always that they experience it more, but oftentimes that there might be unique barriers to acknowledgement, to seeking services. So our results are kind of inconsistent. But again, as I said in that one study that I did, I found that not that my racial minority students experienced more sexual violence on campus, but that they were really hesitant to not only seek services like I talked about, but also to even disclose to their friends. And I found that the reason that they was because I'll make up a fake university name. It's going to be called State University College, right? So at State University College, let's say that the Black community is really, really small. And so they would call it like Black State. That would be the name for their Black community, right? And the students would say to me, Black State's really small. There aren't a lot of Black students on this campus. And if I tell my friends that this other student in Black State sexually assaulted me, what if they don't believe me? And I'm ostracized from the only racial community on this campus that there is. And so they were incredibly hesitant to disclose to their friends because that network loss, that peer loss could not be replicated. And that's not to say that the white students on those campuses didn't also fear victim blaming, but it didn't create this kind of insurmountable barrier in the same way. Because when those students did experience victim blaming, because they absolutely did, and they experienced network loss because they did, they were able to find new friend groups that still had certain shared identity characteristics. Whereas we know from network research and how racial networks impact education, that having racial peer groups can make a very big difference for racial minority students in their success in college. And so that fear of loss, if it can't be replicated, was a huge barrier. So, not necessarily about risk for experiencing that violence and victimization, but more a barrier in seeking services and disclosure. Another group that we know has both increased odds for sexual violence on campus and unique barriers are students with disabilities. And these are all different types of disabilities. So physical disabilities, learning disabilities, intellectual disabilities, all different types. So we found in studies that they have increased risk for that. And are we talking about that? Are we making sure that we're aware of that and how that can impact the way that we provide our services? And so we know that they have unique risk for that as well. Another group that I've seen folks talk about is international students. When you're bringing in students from another country, do they know kind of what our culture is around violence, around alcohol? What are our laws? How do they function? And so we have found that a lot of times they kind of don't know how to come forward in that way because the system is so different. I mean, if I was in another country, I wouldn't know what to do, right? I wouldn't know what their laws are and what the process is like. So that has been something we talk about. Now, when it comes to research on perpetrators, a lot of our research on perpetrators is old. And I think the reason for this is that there have been concerns over legal liability in asking those types of questions. That's because in the last decade, a lot of our campus sexual assault research has come from what's called campus climate surveys. And campus climate surveys are usually done by the university itself. And so the university itself asking its own students questions about perpetration, well, a lot of legal counsel said, let's not do that. So we don't have as much research on perpetrators as we used to. But if we want to look at that body of research, that when we were kind of able to and asking those questions actively, we found that students, specifically male students who support rape myths, are more likely to admit to an act that meets the legal definition of sexual assault. That's always how it's said in those studies. they don't typically come forward and say, yeah, I've raped people. They're coming forward, with this very specific behavioral question, and they're admitting to that, not knowing that that's classified as a crime. So men who support rape myths, men who kind of have hatred towards women, we've found have higher rates of admitting to those definitions. And then men that are involved in hyper-masculine organizations on campus. So again, this brings us back to those kind of rape-prone environments of sports and athletics, as well as contact sports, so specifically football, as well as fraternities. And those environments, if we want to look at why, we can turn to Walter de Casaretti's theory of male peer support theory, and look at how men often support other men in those kind of conversations about how to navigate struggles in their romantic and sexual relationships. And so they're supporting those kind of ideologies. And even when there are men in those environments who don't agree and wouldn't do those things, they don't speak up because of this fear of not being viewed as masculine enough. And there are other types of structural barriers, I would say, kind of on campus that help those spaces continue to have this problem with sexual violence. Of there are these elevated, sports teams on campus, and I went to a couple of very large universities, and at one of them, the basketball team was really big, and so they had their own dorms, and they were treated very differently. And if something went wrong in those spaces, they kind of wanted to cover it up because they didn't want their star athlete to not be able to be on the team. And so looking at what our values are on campus of what's more important, winning a football game or the safety of our college students. And with fraternities in Greek life, the national level organizations that run those, I forget what the actual name of it is, like the Pan-Hellenic or Council or something like that. They have rules, so they're not university rules, they're kind of national Greek life rules that only fraternities can serve alcohol at their parties. Sororities aren't allowed to do that. And so it funnels the control of alcohol, which is, this hot commodity on college campuses, especially if we're talking about underage drinking, into these very hyper-masculine spaces. And so when we talk about perpetrators on college campuses, that's typically what we end up talking about, is those kind of rape-prone environments. But again, we don't have as much research about it as we used to.
Wow, that's so interesting and really helpful information to learn about. And I feel like right now we all have a much better understanding of, the definition, yes, of campus sexual assault, but also just all these other, the context, the different factors, risk factors, different characteristics, just all of it. Like it's all been very informative. So thank you both for, again, everything that you've shared so far. And so now that we do have this, better understanding of campus sexual assault, just zooming out a little bit, like Dr. Radijak said, I wanted to ask you, Rose, you said you've been doing this for quite some time now. And so just over the course of your career working with different types of survivors, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered? And this can be just sexual assault survivors generally, or if you have specific experiences with campus or college students that you can share or speak about.
I think what I have to say does encompass all of those. I think it's similar for whether it happened on campus or not, but some of the biggest challenges are, but sometimes it's more real on a campus. So, but some of the biggest challenges that I would say are still out there, as old as I am and as long as I've been doing this, is like closing the gap on the reality of sexual assault and what that is, and then services on and off campus. We mentioned that earlier, like it's kind of hard to get services to get them connected to services, but sometimes it's as simple as they just don't know where to go. But then it's also, there's other intersectional factors at play as to why some folks may not want to go get services. There may be climate factors at play as to why folks don't want to go get services on campus. And then there may be other reasons why they don't want to go off campus. So I think that's still maintains a challenge, is closing the gap on the reality of that crime and connecting them to services. The other thing I think is another big challenge that has not changed, unfortunately, is the misconception of sexual assault. And oftentimes that is internalized by all of us, and students internalize that. So I think that's why we have that period of processing and trying to figure out in the help seeking behavior, whether or not that happens, is what was this? Did this happen? And all of the, again, misconceptions are there, the socialized things that they've heard since they were young. That is a barrier, that is a challenge. Again, the misconception of sexual assault on the road to healing, it serves as a barrier to that. It serves as a barrier to even reporting, if that's something that's important to folks. But most importantly, to me, I think it's very challenging, because I feel like it's helpful for those to have someone to talk to, a safe person to talk to, an expert to be able to process what's happened to them, so that they can truly then, when they're ready, make a decision on the options that they have, whether to report or not report, or go here or go there, whatever it is they need to do. I'm also, another big challenge that has not changed either is the response. We mentioned earlier about disclosure and what that could look like, what that doesn't look like. It's not usually, it's like with child sexual assault, I would tell folks, you're not gonna have a child that's gonna come to you and say, on this day at this time, I was sexually assaulted. Like, there's gonna be hints that are dropped. It's incumbent upon all of us as a campus community, as a whatever community, to be able to pick up on those and to know what that means, and to be able to, again, just simply say, I am so sorry this happened to you. And how about we go here and talk to this person, whatever, or I believe you, those things. And I think that I could talk about challenges all day long. I'll end with this one. I think there's system failures all across the board. Just failure to sexual assault. When you have someone who finally, is acknowledging what happened to me was a sexual assault, or was this thing. And then they finally step out and tell somebody. If they're not at that point, kind of cut off, unintentionally shied away because someone's, the response is, well, why did you go there? There's always those things. So let's just say that doesn't happen. So they pass that. So yay, they're on to the next. Then they finally, they think through, okay, they muster up that energy and courage to go to report. And then when they go to report, and if they're not believed, or nothing happens with their case, or even, I think worse, is it goes all the way through the system and there's a not guilty. So none of that means that it didn't happen. But I do hate the way that some perpetrators, and those who want to protect those perpetrators because they're assets to the university, they're assets to a football team, or they're assets to whatever, or they're well liked in the community, they will utilize that not guilty, or they will utilize that system failure to say that it didn't happen. She was lying. And we know that the lying, that false reports are not common at all. No one would, in their right mind, would want to put themselves in that situation. I think if folks just really understood all the anguish that survivor has gone through to finally make it to report, but the false reports, again, are not very common. So just those roadblocks to justice and accountability for somebody who has committed that crime. And I know it's different for Title IX and all the reasons that Dr. Radczyk talked about, that they're not coming forward there. But those are the challenges that continue to this day. And I'm hoping that we can begin to take more steps toward mitigating those. But again, system failures, closing the gap, the misconception, the lack of response to those disclosures. I hope that those are still challenges. And I think we're getting better, but we have a long way to go.
I wanted to add two things off of what Rose said. One, I think I love that idea of I kind of see it as almost like raising the bar of what we deem as acceptable or not. I hear that from students whenever I do consent lectures. I always going to want to go like, well, where's the line? Like when I talk about intoxication and consent, and I'm like, if you have to ask that question, you have passed the line. Like, wouldn't we all much prefer to know for sure we didn't harm someone? Let's all raise the bar of what's considered acceptable or not acceptable behavior, because just above the level of, oh, it wasn't a crime yet, should still be unacceptable behavior. behavior. Victimization can still happen even if it's something that's not technically illegal. Right? We talk about those barriers a lot in my classes. And then the other thing is I wanted to point out two opportunities that schools have that don't exist, I think, as well off campus when it comes to sexual violence. So the first is that we have a lot of free services for students on college campuses that regular folk in non-college students don't have access to. And so making sure that students are aware of them, because we have those services. They're oftentimes free. Stopping campus sexual assault helps our enrollment. Having good services on our college campus helps our enrollment. And so if folks are on college campuses trying to fight their fight and they don't think their administration's listening, use the enrollment talk, because that can really make them think that, hey, maybe we should put money towards having an on-campus advocate, because it will help with enrollment for students.
That's smart. I love that. I love that.
Yeah, thank you both so much for that information that you shared. I think just this idea of raising the bar, like there's always room for improvement. We can always, do better. And so I absolutely love that too. And so if you don't mind, Rose, we want you to keep rambling. So I want to ask this next question because I think it kind of it leads in better to then my last question for Dr. Radijak. So I wanted to ask you, Rose, if you could talk a little bit about the consequences of campus sexual assault, just speaking micro or macro level, anything that you want to share about, what are the consequences of campus sexual assault?
Oh gosh, that's a loaded question. I love it. I love it. It's loaded. There's so many, so much. Okay, so so public safety, macro, right? Public safety accountability is something that is a consequence. And I think on a micro level, to counter that is the sense of safety. Talk about enrollment. You want a sense of safety if a parent feels like their child's going to be safe there. The child feels like they have a sense of safety, or the student, I should say, sorry, I'm so old. A student feels that I should have a sense of safety. I think that's a good that's a positive thing. But so public safety is I think macro consequence. I think climate, right? We talked earlier about how important in all the what the tone that sets, the framework that sets. So on a macro level, a consequence of sexual assault is the climate is going to be off. That also, again, enrollment. Now I've got that seared in my mind, Dr. Radijak. But I think climate affects so many different things as far as success rates, engagement rates, and all of those things. So I think the climate is again a consequence. Your climate will not be optimum if there's continuous sexual assault and it's not addressed. I think on a micro level, I think a consequence of that is that you drop engagement. There's not retention. So again, those enrollment numbers start to go down, because I think that's the one thing that we have seen is they end up dropping out. And then the lack of connection, not feeling that they belong. So then they're going to go to another school and start over. So I think all of those are consequences, both micro and macro. I think it does affect all of those things on a macro and a micro level that hit the bottom line, that hit the sense of safety and public safety as a whole.
That's great. Great stuff. Thank you so much, Rose. And so just still talking about more like macro level, zooming out a little bit. My last question for Dr. Radijak is about like the media. So how do you think the media has influenced what people know about campus sexual assault and then how people are affected by it?
Really interesting time period where, because we're in this like post Me Too environment, people kind of think that we're going to do better, because I think more people do have maybe a little bit better knowledge about sexual violence and things like sexual harassment and discrimination. But we haven't had a really big culture shift. And I think we have this almost amnesia as a society, and that we think that it's like the first time that we've ever kind of had this big focus on this. And it's like, no, it's not. So with campus sexual assault, I think we kind of see this cyclical pattern where something will happen, and maybe it's a huge talk about Title IX and they're changing the policy and we're having all these protests on campus. And but it's like, well, we did that 2 decades ago, and the statistics are the same. The culture shift isn't quite the same. Even in one of my classes this week, we talked about sexual harassment and we watched a documentary about Anita Hill. And I asked them at the end, if that same thing happened today, do you think the results would be the same? And you always get the students that go, no, well, with Me Too, like, social media, we think it would be different. And I just wait for a student to finally raise their hand and go, well, wasn't there that, Christine Blasey Ford? And so, we talk about how like it actually did, it wasn't identical, case type thing, but the results were the same. And so we almost have this amnesia around it. But I would say that we have some good examples of how media covers sexual violence. I think in general, some of our news media is starting to catch on a little bit about how to be a little bit more ethical in their coverage. So, even if we move away from sexual violence for a moment and think about like mass shootings and, this shift away from this hyper focus on the perpetrator and naming their name, but instead focusing on the victims of those crimes. So we are seeing some shifts in those. For example, I had a colleague when I was at the University of Kentucky who had a really close cousin who was raped and murdered when she was a college student. And she always shared about how the news media harassed her family, that they were always trying to get a quote, because it was really big in the town that it happened in, and how they really felt like the news media was this additional level of trauma on that family when they were trying to kind of process and survive what had happened to, right, their family member. And so trying to see how can we be ethical and how we cover that as news reporters. How can we take trauma-informed care into news coverage? We should care about more than just the number and the clickbait, right? So we kind of expect there to be this culture shift to have happened, but we're not seeing that in the data, and we're not necessarily seeing that in our lived experiences. But we have had some shows that I think have had some really great coverage of the reality of sexual violence. There was a Netflix show, I actually use it in my classes, called Unbelievable. And the first two episodes are like the best example of what not to do for trauma-informed care and then what to do for trauma-informed care as a detective. So it's a really good example of good and bad kind of police coverage and how to respond and how to investigate. And I think at the same time, though, we have an even bigger push on this true crime obsession, of people, wanting to have every single documentary about every single crime, and the push for podcasts about true crime. And while that's great, I mean, it gives more students to my college. But I think the problem is that type of media is so hyper focused on the person who's causing the harm, with very little care for the survivors and their family members, that we're seeing that it's kind of dragging that family back through this victimization again and again and again without care for them. And what does that say about us when it causes people to be obsessed with serial killers and not really care about the harm that they caused? So we're seeing a problem as kind of a result of that. So I'd say it's a mixed bag on the media. Media does have an ability to help us understand this, or even one show, again, it's a Netflix show. I apparently watch too much Netflix, that did a good job and a bad job at the same time, was the show 13 Reasons Why. Now, I had read that book a long time ago before it was a show. I was in, like, I don't know, like high school or something when I read that book. But when they turned it into the show, it did have really good nuanced conversation about how sexual harassment can escalate into sexual violence, and poor responses from both disclosing to friends, people not seeing the red flags, but also you know how they were a little bit irresponsible and how they showed suicide in that show. And so people had a lot of critiques about that. And so people that are producing media, there are responsible ways to cover sexual violence, and irresponsible ways. It shouldn't just be something you throw in for shock value. We should be having nuanced conversations about it. And I think we're doing a little bit better at that, but we still, I think, lean too far into this real rape script type of an approach. And then the last thing is, I think that when we talk about how college is represented in media, it's typically all about the party culture. How much of media about what happens on college campuses is actually about going to class and the stress of finals. It's more about kind of pushing this idea of what your college experience should be like. Not all campuses are like that. And should we be shifting our narrative to maybe help shift what that college experience is like? So I think those are some of the issues with our media, but also how it can have an impact. We just need to be ethical and responsible in how we cover that. We see some of that. If people are interested in reading more about that, would really recommend reading Know My Name by Chanel Miller. She does a really, really good job of talking about how media coverage impacted her negatively as a survivor, but also how it took one news reporter to want to cover her story in an ethical way to really start to make that change in trajectory in the type of attention that the story received. So we can see both the good and bad in that book really, really well. And it's just a powerful text.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Dr. Radajak. It was so incredibly helpful. And I just in my own beliefs, like I just always think of the media as this double-edged sword. And then just thinking about like sexual assault or sexual violence specifically, like it's just, oh, and then even like, this is probably getting into another off topic, but like the sexual violence in like horror films and slasher films and just all of that. It's icky, just in my own, when I see that. But thank you for everything that you shared. I think it's really insightful. And for these last couple of questions, they're just more so about like looking ahead, next steps, just kind of moving forward. And so I wanted to ask, in both of your opinions, what are some prevention strategies to reduce sexual assault on college campuses? I know this is a big one too. It's a broad question. So anything that you want to share about that?
The question is prevention strategies. Yeah, that's a loaded question. Again, great question. These are the questions that need to be asked. So I thank you for that. Their prevention is so layered, and the understanding is varied, depending on who is in charge of prevention programming. You'll have everything from, watch your drink, which is somewhat prevention, to, then there's deeper levels that as an organization at TASA that we feel that should be had. But the thing that I've seen that's most popular with campuses is bystander intervention type of intervention. So, and those are, again, depending on which program or which creator, it really just depends on, again, there's the climate culture, you have to have all these fits that go there. So I think those are really good, again, depending. But there's also, and I don't know if this is prevention, but there's something about consent and folks understanding what is consent. Back in the day, one of the first research that was done in Texas, I had just started out at TASA, and there was the first prevalence of sexual assault in Texas that was done. So it was back in the early 2000s. Also, what they did is they focus group parents and students and asked them about consent. And what they found is that students felt like consent was more about permission to their parents. So they didn't even really, and these were teenagers going into college. So they didn't even really understand consent in the sexual context. And I think a lot of that has to do with whether or not we are talking in reality about healthy sexuality. I know that's not to get, hot topic, political topics or anything. It is what it is. I think if we're going to prevent this in any way, everyone needs to understand what healthy sexuality is so that they can recognize when there's been an assault on that. So that's, I think I'll stop there and give it over to Dr. Radajak.
Yeah, I think tying off of with that consent idea is how we're showing consent in our media. I always like to say the first time I saw Frozen in theaters, I damn near stood up and clapped at the end because Kristoff asks Anna if he can kiss her. And I was so excited. I was like, oh my gosh, there's consent being displayed in a Disney film. This is amazing. Because we hadn't seen that before, right? I mean, the Snow White film just came out. So like talking about, kissing princesses with, when they're asleep, So thinking about those conversations about consent are huge. And I think this really ties into the fact that if we wait until college to have these conversations, it's too late. It doesn't mean we can't try to have these kinds of conversations in college, but for a lot of students, by the time they've gotten to college, they've already experienced sexual violence. They've already experienced dating violence. We need to have these conversations before they get there. They're adults at that point. Yes, their brains are still forming, they're still learning, but they are adults, and a lot of their cultural beliefs and values are very instilled at them at that point. And so, if we're gonna have these conversations, we need to have them sooner. And that's something that I think people see as somehow, as Rose said, like a really political type thing. And it's like, well, they can be age appropriate, right? We're not trying to tell people that they should be having sex before marriage. That's not what these types of training and education programs are. I say every single person would want to be able to support their child if they experience, sexual child abuse. But if the only education they're getting is the terrible abstinence only sex education I got in schools, then those kids aren't going to come forward. So we need to be having these conversations sooner on. And then also, I'll just say that better education for faculty and staff. We do take a Title IX training every year, but it's tedious and people aren't, latching on to that information. The amount of faculty that come up to me and say, Katie, how do I make a Title IX report? Like, where do I do that? Because they know I have to do them all the time. And so making sure that we have that education for faculty and staff that is meaningful and not just an annoying training. And bystander education is a step forward for sure. We know that giving trainings that tell half of the class that they're going to be rape victims and the other half that they're going to be perpetrators is not successful. And treating people like a solution to the problem is. But it needs to be more than just a checkbox. And I think that's how a lot of universities treat it. And so if you're going to do it that way, then it's not going to be as effective as it needs to be.
Yeah, I love that. I'm gonna put that on a t-shirt. More than a checkbox. Like, come on, it's gotta do something. Like, yeah, more than a checkbox. I love that. And so this is related to prevention, but more of like more than a checkbox. Like, what else can you do aside from having these prevention strategies? What are some ways that we can actually improve services for student survivors of campus sexual assault? And whoever wants to go first.
I guess I'll take a stab. Ways to improve services. It's anything you can do to improve understanding, them clearing up the misconception, because that is going to improve, response to as a whole. So on that level, because I think as Dr. Radicek said, the services are there, right? Because I think, when I have had conversations with college students, it's either I don't have no idea, oh, we have that here. So it's almost, there's this awareness campaign of there are services, but then that's got to land right to the reality of sexual assault. If it's just sexual assault hotline, that's probably why no one's going to call, because they're still not even understanding what happened to them as sexual assault. Eventually it would, and then maybe a friend would see it and identify and say, you were sexually assaulted, let's call this number. But I think just creative ways to be able to message this inappropriate behavior, and giving students an opportunity to confidentially talk about it and process that, whether that happens on campus or it has to happen off campus. I think also a collaboration between off campus, like rape crisis centers, and the services on campus are super important. I think it needs to be, there is value in having an advocate or a navigator, if you will, on campus to be able to say, here's what you need to do. Here's your options on the next step. Okay, here is here are your options here. Just someone to lay that out to allow them the pathway of decision making. I think that's important. And so again, it's something to have that, because some campuses may have that, but then how do you connect it? And I think it's just that framework and being creative in how we can ensure, whether it's, flyers on the wall, or if it's events that, are not, here's the Rape Crisis Center event, it's just like these events that kind of talk about the issue and not, let's do the sexual assault thing, and maybe, and I'm not saying that we should never say the words, I'm just saying that I think we need to get creative to meet people where they are.
Absolutely. I think my two answers is advocates and money. So advocates are huge. Advocates are huge. I, I was kind of lucky in a couple of the universities that I attended throughout my educational career had amazing advocates. When I got my PhD at the University of Kentucky, they had an entire center they called it VIP, so the Violence Intervention and Prevention Center, which, I mean, University of Kentucky is the home of Green Dot, which is a bystander intervention program. So I guess it makes sense, but a whole center, and they had several advocates, and they ran these great programs. And so it was both just like a safe space to come to. They weren't located within a Title IX office. And so just having advocates on campus is huge. And then the second thing is money. Universities need to put money into these resources. In my doctoral dissertation, both of the universities that were involved in that study had counseling centers, but I would hear all the time that there weren't appointments, that people were too busy, the hours didn't work, that they had to wait forever, or there was a session limit, right? You could only have 3 sessions or 10 sessions. And as someone who's going through the trauma of sexual violence, if you hear that you can only talk to this person for 3 sessions, are you even going to bother to go? So how do we get universities to put money into these resources? Because if they have them, but they're not well staffed, they're not well funded, they're not going to be doing the work that they need to be doing.
That's very, very true. Not just in this area, but I mean, in all areas, I feel like money is important, money talks. And so absolutely, I definitely agree with that. And so just generally speaking, and just to kind of wrap things up, what do you all think is the most important thing that people should know about sexual assault on college campuses? Again, this is a big one. It's a broad question, but if there was one thing that you could implant into everybody's mind to kind of, get them to know, to recognize about campus sexual assault, what would that be?
People aren't lying when they say that they've experienced sexual assault. They're not lying. As Rose said earlier, false reports are incredibly rare, very rare. Coming forward and telling someone is so difficult. Going through a reporting process is so re-traumatizing. So just believe people. And I think that ties into my second point. And I said this earlier, but when somebody discloses to you, make sure that you say that you believe them, and that you're listening, and you're going to be there, and not have that angry response or that victim blaming response. So believe people, and remember to remind people that it's not their fault, because they're almost certainly beating themselves up and internalizing those messages. So I would say those are the 2 most important things.
I agree. And I would only add to that, that if somebody does disclose to you after you have done what Dr. Radachek has said, consider that an extreme honor, because they saw you as a safe person. And I think that if we hold dear to what it means to be safe and how important safety is in the moment when somebody discloses, I think we're setting them up in the best way that we can.
Yeah, thank you both for that. I really love how you framed that, Rose, at the end. Like it puts it like on, on the person. And I mean, we are all very self-centered people for the most part. But people like you, Rose, in your role, you're not self-centered. But just, having that, like, wow, like they chose me, to disclose or to share this. It really is an honor. So I love just how you framed that. And I think for me, like the one thing that comes to mind, like if there's something I could put in everybody's head, just to not forget, like consent is not it can be like taken back. I forget what the Dr. Radajak can probably say it better than I can, but just like, yes, it's not, you can take it back. It's not just, consent is given and then that's it. Like it can be taken back. And so that's just something that I was thinking of as I was listening to y'all. And so I guess my next question is just related to the work that each of you do. And so I just wanted to ask if you could share a little bit about your plans for your future research, Dr. Radajak, and then your plans for advocacy as you move forward with TASA and, things like that. And so if you wanted to go first, Dr. Radajak.
Yeah, sure. So I'm always working on a lot of projects. I have some things that aren't related to campus sexual assault, but it's always gender and sexual-based violence. But as it relates to sexual assault on campus, we're always in a holding pattern with Title IX, waiting to see what's happening. I've done research on Title IX before, and I think we're at a very interesting point. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens in the next several months, in the next couple of years. We kind of toss Title IX around every 4 to 8 years, and it's lurching universities left, right, and center. And so it's a very important policy. And so that's something I'm always got an eye on to see where it's headed and what we need to be doing about it. And then another area as it applies to campus sexual assault with my research I've been really interested in has to do with geography, as in rurality, small towns, big cities, are the schools in suburbia? How does that impact not just how the violence occurs, but I think more about its services, and who is providing those services? How does it function in those spaces? Most of our research is done at large universities that are typically well-funded or, in more urban spaces. And how does that function at tiny schools? So I've been really interested in how rurality versus, urban spaces and suburban spaces kind of impacts that service provision and how that's going to impact a student and their healing process and journey. So that's always been a topic that's always kind of been scratching the back of my head for the past couple of years.
So some of the things that we are looking at doing at TASA, there's a lot, there's a ton of things. So I'll start with first, like law and policy. We are in the middle of legislative session, and we're trying to enhance crime victims' rights enforcement. As you know, in the state of Texas, we have a long list of crime victims, a Bill of Rights, but there's no teeth to those. So we're looking, and our intention is to add teeth to those. Also, privacy and confidentiality, enhancing those for survivors. In some parts of the state, we have judges who will allow the live streaming of not only just child sexual assault cases, but adult sexual assault cases. So making that against the law. There's been guidance that says that's not best practice. COVID kind of, made things a little interesting, but then they've come back around. But there's still some that are doing that. And I'm not saying it's intentional. It's just that we know that that's not good for child or adult sexual assault survivors. So it's those things, and then the implementation of the laws and policies that we passed this legislative session. That's going to be a big thing that we're working on. We also are looking at, it's called TCAT, the Texas Core Advocacy Training. It's funny that we called it TCAT. The person that's working, the project manager, myself, we both love cats, so we just kind of giggle when we call it TCAT, and she even has a logo with the cat, with that we're not going to be able to use, but it's cute. But anyway, it's called Texas Core Advocacy Training, and so what we're finally doing is going to make a consistent training for anyone that does the work at a sexual assault program in the state of Texas, so that we're all learning about sexual assault in the same way, we're learning about advocacy in the same way, and so just to kind of standardize in a good way the practice of advocacy and counseling and services. So, and we're working with the Office of the Attorney General because they are the ones who certify the training programs. And that's what also is tied to Texas statute, because sexual assault programs are defined in Texas statute. Advocates who can do the advocacy in the exam room and in the interrogation or the interview room with law enforcement, it points back to the sexual assault advocate as defined in Texas. So all of that is going to come together very nicely, because right now, currently, everyone's doing their own training. They have a framework, but they're just kind of, so it just depends on what they decide to put together. Very soon, they will have one unified that we've put together. We've been working on it for years, so we're very excited about that coming out for sexual assault programs. And then I think the other thing is the law policy section of the program. Oh, is just data collection, is just wanting to make sure that we are collecting data. We have a big law enforcement sexual assault training that we do every year in conjunction with the governor's office. We have it in South Padre Island because we feel like we want to try to mix in a little bit of wellness with learning for those who do that hard work of law enforcement, being law enforcement officers around the state of Texas. We have a focus on rural Texas, but we have suburban and some urban areas as well. So what we want to do is to try to capture the kind of work, the impact of that training when they go back to tell us about the cases that the sexual assault, adult sexual assault cases that they've worked on. Did the training impact that at all? Was there any positive or changes or outcomes as a result of that training? So we're going to start that kind of stuff. So looking at that. Also, last legislative session, we were able to secure money for border and rural Texas to get sexual assault programming in those areas. You know, we have 254 counties in Texas. We only have 73 certified sexual assault programs. So there's a lot of counties without that work, and most of them are rural and some on the border. So we were able to get that, secure that money. And so that's another thing we're working on with our team, is to collect that data. And I also mentioned to the Office of the Attorney General, because they're the ones that distribute the money, is that we need to have some flexibility. Doing this work in rural Texas is going to be different. We can't focus on volume, then that's not the right focus, because you're not going to have it. We got to look at impact. We have to look at all these different things, and it's going to be built in a different way. So just kind of trying to rethink how we approach this issue. And although I just got through saying we want to standardize the training, which I think we need to in a good way, there's also ways to capture the uniqueness that's necessary to serve survivors, whether they're from rural, urban areas. And so we're working on all of those things all together. I'll keep you posted on how it's going.
Please do. Please do. It's not both of you. It sounds like you both have a lot of exciting and valuable work that you're doing and have been working on for years. And so thank you for sharing that. And I know I'm not just speaking for myself when I say, like, we look forward to, hearing and reading all about the work that you're doing. And so I did just want to close off with just this last question on if you had any other comments or thoughts regarding campus sexual assault, any last minute thoughts or takeaways that you want to share before we kind of wrap up here.
I just always like to end everything that if there are survivors listening, to just remember that it's not your fault, and that healing is possible, that it's usually a cyclical process and it's a hard process, but you deserve the time that it takes to seek those services and get to the place that you want to be in. Just remember that it's never your fault.
And I'll add to that and end by saying that there are people out there that care, that are safe, and that want to help. And it is my hope that you are able to connect to those people, because we are there, and you've got folks like TASA who are fighting to ensure that the funding is there for them to be there to help you. So yeah.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. I know the listeners won't be able to see this, but there was a lot of heart reactions going on throughout the course of our conversation. So truly, truly, thank you so much, Dr. Radajak, Rose Luna. We really, really appreciate you for taking the time to share your expertise and to talk to all of us regarding sexual assault on college campuses. We hope that this information will help others by raising awareness. And so we really want to thank you all for taking the time to watch or listen to our CVI Talks presentation. We hope that you'll stay tuned for future CVI Talks. Don't forget to follow us on social media for the latest and greatest concerning CVI. Thank you.